This is a Middle Loop quick class.
Hi, I'm Jerry with Middle Loop, and this is a quick class, part 3 in our Waypoint series for the Mavic 3. Today we're setting up our Waypoint mission on-site. In our last episode, part 2, we showed setting up the mission ahead of time based on the maps. Well, today we're showing our preferred method, setting up the mission on location using the drone to actually set each waypoint. Not only will we explain why we like this method better, but we'll also throw in a couple of nuggets on planning your mission as well as considerations for the end-of-flight and signal loss settings. We mentioned we have an entire series on waypoints. To get to the series, you can either use the link that just popped up above, or we've included a link in the description as well as links to each individual video. And of course, subscribers who have clicked that notify bell will receive a message as we add new ones. At the time of this recording, this video applies to waypoints in the Mavic 3, Mavic 3 Cine, and Mavic 3 Classic. If DJI adds more, we'll provide an update in the description. In today's quick class, we'll start with pre-planning, some questions you might want to answer before setting up the mission. Then the actual setting of the waypoints. We'll walk through it step by step. Next, we'll go over global and mission settings, followed by saving and loading your waypoint mission. Then we'll show running the mission. And finally, we'll answer the question why we prefer this method over the one we covered in part 2 of the series. Planning any mission is important, but with waypoint missions, it seems to be even more so. And it can be a little tricky because oftentimes when setting up a waypoint mission, you're doing so around something that doesn't exist yet. Like in today's example, we'll be capturing photos here. This is the site of a future apartment complex. Of course, the mission can be tweaked once the construction starts and the building takes shape. However, there are some cases, like in an aerial time-lapse, where once the mission is set, you really don't want to make changes. In that example, the drone needs to be as close as possible to the exact same spot every time you run the mission. So how do you plan a mission when something doesn't exist yet? The key is to get as much information about what you're capturing as possible. Here's an example where the builder hired us to do an aerial time-lapse that he wanted to use on his website. And because we were working with the builder, we were able to get our hands on the blueprints, which told us everything we needed to know, like how tall the addition was going to be and how far into the backyard it would go. In today's example, we're not working with the builder, but based on an artistic rendering that was filed with the Planning Commission, we know this is going to be a 5-story building, and we have an idea of the basic footprint. That helps a lot in estimating the mission. And in this case, we're fortunate that there's a building about the same size right next door, which is a great model for approximating altitude and how far back from the site we want to be. But even if you don't have a building next door to help, you can use any building about the same size as your model to help you plan. So what's the goal of your mission? Are you capturing photos or video? This will probably make a difference in planning. If you're planning on both, our recommendation is to set up 2 separate missions, one for each. When shooting video, you probably want slower speeds throughout the mission. With photos, you can take a shot at one waypoint and then use a high speed to get to the next waypoint to take the next. Also, you might consider whether to use the hover feature. Check out our deep dive video on using hover. Now, we're not going to get into what are the best camera settings in this video. Just be aware that these settings are not saved in your waypoint mission, and you'll need to check them and/or set them each time you run the mission. But since we're talking about pre-planning, there's one camera setting that should be decided before setting up the mission, and that's the aspect ratio. We'll explain more in a minute. Just decide whether you'll be shooting in 4:3 or 16:9. Surveying the site is always important. One of the first questions we want to answer is where to launch from. With waypoint missions, we always try to launch from the same spot every time we run it. And we have a best practice of setting our first waypoint directly above the launch location. It's part of our obstacle avoidance strategy. So when picking our launch location, we're looking for a spot with no wires or trees above, obviously, and one that's far enough back from our subject so that we can maintain line of sight with the drone throughout the mission. And in this case, we need to keep in mind that there's going to be a building there at some point, which might interfere with line of sight. And then there's the planning of each waypoint location. Of course, you're going to be careful to make sure there's no objects between waypoints, but here too, we try to foresee future obstacles. In our example, we're shooting a construction site, so not only are we anticipating where the building will be, but also the possibility of cranes up in the air. Therefore, we'll be staying well outside the property line. You'll notice that we never rely on the drone's obstacle avoidance system. I'm glad the drone has it, but I plan on never needing it. We'll have a little more to say about obstacle avoidance later when we discuss the loss of signal and end-of-flight settings. Setting up the waypoints on-site is actually pretty easy. Basically, you fly to each location where you want to set a waypoint, compose the shot you want, and set the point by tapping the little plus button on the screen. If you're using an RC Pro, you have an option of pushing the C1 button on the back of the controller. Today, we're setting up a simple mission to capture 4 photographs, one on each corner of this lot, which is the future site of that apartment complex we mentioned. So let's set it up. Our drone is on the ground at the launch point that we decided on earlier. We've already gone through our pre-flight checklist and we're ready to fly. Since our mission is capturing photos, notice that we have the drone set to take photos and we have the aspect ratio set as planned. As we said, when setting up the mission, we want the camera set the same as it will be when we run the mission. That's because we'll be flying to each location and composing the shot there. So it's a good idea that the aspect ratio is set as it will be when we run it. Okay, let's tap the waypoint icon on the screen. Now let's go ahead and start the propellers while we wait for the satellites to sync up.
The home point has been updated.
And there you go. Let's take off. As we said earlier, it's our best practice to set our first waypoint directly above the launch point, at about the same altitude as our second waypoint. So in this case, we want to go up to about 170 feet. But as you can see, the waypoint interface is covering up how high we're flying. So we need to minimize that interface, which you can do by tapping this up arrow. Some of these icons are pretty small, so we always use a stylus when setting up waypoints. There's a link to the one we use in the description. With the waypoint interface minimized, let's head straight up to our desired altitude. And there you go. We're now at the location of our first waypoint. Now, we just happen to be facing our subject, but that's not required since we're not taking a photo here. Let's maximize the waypoint interface, tap that down arrow, and then to set the waypoint, simply tap the little plus icon on the screen. And there you have it. We've added our first waypoint. Now let's fly to the location of the second waypoint, which is where we'll be taking our first photo. You'll notice that we'll be minimizing and maximizing the waypoint interface throughout the mission as needed. Okay, just a quick check to make sure we're not hovering over people or traffic. That's pretty good. Let's go just a little further. Okay, that's where we want to be. Now let's compose our first shot. We are already at the altitude that we've planned, so let's adjust the yaw. All right, that looks pretty good. Now the tilt of the camera. And if you're shooting video, you can also adjust the zoom, which for whatever reason is not allowed when shooting photos. If you try it, you get this message. Once you have it the way you want, set the second waypoint. Okay, with our photo composed, let's go ahead and set the camera action of this waypoint to take a photo. Now you can do this later, but let's go ahead and do it now. Tap the edit button of the waypoint just added. Camera action is probably already highlighted. If not, tap on it. Then select Take Photo. And to get back to the other screen, tap that left arrow. Okay, we're going to repeat for the remaining 3 corners. The last waypoint and photo are set, and we're done with the setup we'll do while flying the drone. So we'll just bring it back and land it and move on to the next steps. With the drone down, we've tapped on the map to switch over to this view, and we've zoomed out a little. Here you can see the mission we set up. Here's the first waypoint directly over our launch point, and here's the point of our first photo, and of course the remaining 3. Now let's set the mission settings. Tap the 3 dots on the right side of the waypoint interface. But before we make any changes, notice that it's calculated the distance from the first to the last waypoint to be around 3,400 feet, and it's estimating that it will take about 7 minutes to run the mission. So now let's change the global speed. This is the speed that the drone travels as it moves from waypoint to waypoint. It defaults to about 6 miles per hour, which might make sense for a video, but since we're taking photos, let's change it so it gets to each location as fast as possible. With the global speed tab highlighted, drag the slider to the right. The max is about 33 miles per hour, but that's close enough. And now, notice the flight duration has dropped from 7 minutes to just over a minute. Incidentally, you might remember from part 2 of the series that you can edit the speed of any individual waypoint, which might come in handy when shooting video. Let's move on to the end-of-flight setting. This setting tells the drone what to do after completing the last waypoint. Now, when we were planning the mission, We were careful to place our last waypoint in a position so that the drone could return to the first waypoint without hitting any obstacles. And if you recall, we placed our first waypoint directly overhead. That way, it'll come back to me when done and I can land it manually, which is my preference, especially in tight spots. Now, I could have used return to home, but that would cause the drone to descend as it comes back, and I'm a little concerned about a nearby fence. So I'll set end of flight to back to start. The last setting is on signal lost, which tells the drone what to do if it loses communication with the controller. This has happened to me during a Waypoint mission when I was using the Mavic 2 Pro. I couldn't believe it. The drone was only about 200 feet away. Well, it's only happened once, but it's always something I planned for. So let's think about it. Let's say we were to lose the signal about halfway through the mission. The default setting is return to home, but that would mean the drone would come straight back to me while it descends. And in this case, it would take us directly over the construction site. Well, there are a couple trees that could be in the way, plus the possibility of a crane being on site and in the way. Now, I know this drone has good obstacle avoidance, but like I said earlier, you should never rely on that. So we prefer not to use return to home. We could set it to hover, but if we never regain communication, it would eventually run out of battery and then return to home anyway. And I certainly don't want it to land in the river, so I usually set it to continue. This way, it will continue to fly the route that I carefully planned, avoiding objects, and eventually end up straight overhead, which, if I can't regain communications, would ultimately exhaust the battery and then land at my feet. The other advantage of this setting, I won't have to rerun the mission. It will have already captured the photos, and I can simply pack up and go. Let's save the mission. On the left side of the Waypoint interface, tap the icon that looks like a piece of paper. At the top is the mission we just created. We could just simply save it by tapping the Save button and using the default name, but if you want to give it a name that's more meaningful, tap that little pencil icon. This places the cursor in the name field and opens the virtual keyboard. To remove the old name as you type the new one, tap and hold the name field for a second and then release. The entire name will be highlighted. Now simply type the new name, which erases the old. When done, tap Save, and then tap Save again, and then tap anywhere to get back to here. To close the screen, hit that left arrow. Let's quickly cover loading a previously saved mission. Let's assume you've just arrived to the site to run it. With the drone placed at the launch point and connected to the controller, tap the waypoint icon. Now tap that same icon we used to save the waypoint. And from here, simply tap the image of the mission you want to load. To run the mission, you have a couple of options. You could run it with the drone on the ground, which will cause it to automatically take off and then head to the first waypoint, which is fine. Since we placed our first waypoint directly overhead, we don't have to worry about running into anything. But my preference is to get the drone up in the air first. Yes, I have control issues. So here we go up to about 25 feet. Tap the next button on the right, and then tap Go. And just like that, the drone is heading straight up to our first waypoint. So why is this our preferred method? In part 2 of the series, you'll find a link in the description, we covered setting up the mission off-site using the maps. But as we mentioned, this is our preferred method. Here's why. We've talked a lot about our obstacle avoidance strategy, which starts with walking the site ahead of time, picking our launch spot, seeing where the trees and wires are. There's nothing quite like being there to plan your mission. And then there's composing the shot. It's extremely helpful to be able to look through the eye of the camera to frame up that perfect shot and then locking it in. Now, you'll notice we haven't mentioned using point of interest with this method. That's because when we set our waypoints using this process, the heading and gimbal settings are custom. But there are some advantages to using the point of interest feature. If you haven't seen part 2 in our series, you might want to take a look. It not only covers point of interest, but it also covers editing your waypoints. And maybe you'll find that using a hybrid of both methods works best for you. Who knows, perhaps we'll do a video on that. And that's it for part 3 in our series on waypoints. And if you haven't already, subscribe, like, tap that notify bell, and enjoy. Thank you, have a great day, and happy flying.